Hello and a very warm welcome to another edition of Talking Germany, the show where we do just that. And our guest today is one of the world's great conductors. Let me introduce you to Kent Nagano.
Good morning.
Thank you very, very much for joining us today. I know you've got a very tight schedule.
It's very nice to be here.
Cool. Now, Kent Nagano has worked with many of the world's top orchestras, and he's currently musical director of the Bavarian State Opera, based in Munich. Now, you've been based in Germany for the past decade or so, first of all in Berlin, now in Munich, as I mentioned. How much has the German classical canon played a role in your career? And how much is there, you know, what is German music?
For most people who focus upon classical music, I think the German history of literature, the compositional history, it plays a large part in our repertoire. But of course the context changes. When I studied these great masterpieces, I studied them as a student in California. And on the sunny coastline of the West Coast, it's a very, very different context than within, say, Berlin or Munich, where we now live.
So how has your perception changed then, now that you're here in Germany?
Very much has to do with being immersed and fluent within the culture, to be at ease with the culture and to have an awareness of what the historic perspective brings. Language plays a surprisingly large role in interpretation. And to speak the language, to be sensitive to the rhythm, to be aware of the dialogue, social dialogue, plays a very, very strong role in opening up a sensitivity to cultural interpretation.
When you talk about language and music, people often talk about the German sound. Let's use language. Give me some adjectives to describe the German sound.
I think the adjectives that I would use first have to do with nature. Nature here in Germany is spectacular. It's very, very special. It's not to be found anyplace else in the world. Now where we live, for example, near the Alps, the seasons, all four of them, they're brilliant and very theatrical in their own way. That's not to say that California or Quebec or, say, the East Coast of the United States isn't also beautiful, but it's different. To be able to have a feeling for what the nature sounds like, for what it feels like, the reaction between people and nature, it's simply different.
Take us back, if you would, to your childhood, to you as a young boy. What was it like?
It was, in many ways, a wonderful place to grow up. This being in this isolated part of California, as you saw in the film, being so close to the sea and the mountains at the same time was an idyllic setting. I think, like most children, however, we weren't really appreciative of that beauty. We wanted to be in the excitement of the big city because so much that was available to the city life, films, television, grand opera, symphonic repertoire every day of the week, it simply wasn't available to us. Thank goodness our parents did take us on regular excursions to the city, so we had some contact, but still, I think it would be fair to say that we felt a little bit isolated there growing up.
Okay. Talking about your parents, how important are you're a Japanese American, how important are your Japanese roots to you?
That's a very good question. I think as I was growing up, because we were so isolated and because the Japanese American community, it was a very strong community. We stayed together and had a cultural identity. It did mean that I felt aware, very aware of my Japanese American roots. Now... Was it painful at times? For many Japanese Americans, there were painful times there. Or were you beyond that generation? I feel perhaps that was more for my parents and for my grandparents. It's not to say that there weren't awkward moments. For example, as children, many children play kind of war games or gang sort of warfare. I always had to play the enemy as a kid growing up. It's awkward, but I wouldn't say I was lucky enough to be in such a rural area with so much space and so many other immigrant families that much of the pain of my parents' generation was spared.
You have a daughter. She's 10 years old. Would you want her to be a professional musician?
It's a subject I think that all parents struggle with. Yeah. We took the approach that it would not be in our daughter's interest to somehow force a career choice. At the same time, there are certain skills that one only can achieve if you have instruction as a child. So my wife and I took the approach that we would make available to our daughter, if she wanted, the very best musical instruction that was available. Our daughter has chosen to play the piano, to follow in her mother's footsteps, and undergoes a very, very rigorous training schedule. That being said, we've made it clear that she always has the option to stop if it becomes too intense for her.
When you say rigorous, give me a number. How many hours, how many hours a day does she practice or have tuition?
Well, she's 10 now, and she's been performing publicly for the past 3 years. And so, obviously, the number of hours of preparation varies depending on how close a performance is.
Give the viewers an idea. Just give me an average.
I'd say on a daily basis, 3 to 4 hours of practice.
Okay. Kent Nagano was just telling me that you recently worked with a tenor who was particularly good. We don't need to talk names, but tell me why perhaps he was so good.
Yes, in Montreal we're right in the middle of a Johann Sebastian Bach cycle, and we vary. In the last performance just a few weeks ago, we were performing with an ensemble of period instruments and invited a number of European soloists to come. The tenor was extraordinary, and particularly with an organic feel for Bach. And he explained to me later on that, yes, as a young boy, he had sung with a Thomaner choir.
As we saw in that report, it is a strict environment at the St. Thomas Choir School. Is strict a problem? Is strict necessarily a bad thing?
It depends. Strict, I suppose by that you mean discipline. And sure. Discipline, there is no alternative than to have a rigorous discipline. But the paradox is that with discipline comes freedom of expression. And I suppose it depends on actually what the context of that discipline is. We see it in our own child, and in the great tradition of the Thomaner choir, this tradition has produced vast amounts of creativity, which wouldn't come otherwise.
That's interesting. You were talking about you and your wife working together with your daughter and pushing her to the limit. And what would you say if she says no to you? I'm not going to go there.
I suppose that's a part of the context that every parent has to decide. We've decided that we would always make available as an option that our daughter could walk away if she really felt it was too intense. And it is hard work for a child of 9, 8 to practice 4 hours a day. And like all children, there comes a saturation point where she simply will protest. And at that point, we do make it clear that if she really feels it's unbearable, she can stop. And until now, anyway, she's always said, well, I don't really mean it. So.
Interesting. Let's talk about, you're now a musical director of the Bavarian State Opera. Is it fair to say the following, that classical symphony music is still very much addressing a classical symphony audience? Opera is at the moment somehow, there's a new dynamism in opera, a new popularity in opera. There's a sort of, it's become fashionable again. Is that true?
Things historically tend to go in cycles. It is true from box office receipts that at the moment opera seems to have a particular relevance. Perhaps it has something to do, according to sociologists, with this vast multimedia trend that we have going on now through the internet and through technology. Opera in itself is multimedia. But if you look back historically, that feeling of spectacle, that feeling of experiencing many, many different disciplines at the same time, that's always been a part of our society and always been one of the reasons why opera houses have found themselves in the middle of a society. It's nice to see that it's enjoying a great resurgence at the moment.
I love that spectacle in opera, I must say, talking purely for myself. Different question, who are your favourite popular music artists?
Well, I'm getting kind of old now, I think. I'm not nearly as up-to-date as I would like to be.
But who do you have on the turntable, then?
I don't have anyone on the turntable,
oh, that's
unfortunately. The chance to listen to popular music is unfortunately really filtered, because the most often when I'll get a chance is perhaps at the airport, what kind of pop music can you hear at an airport, or on an aeroplane, which is seriously filtered already. We should make a conscious effort to be aware of what people listen to. If we're music directors, it's part of our responsibility, and I've got to do something about that.
Everybody, whoever turns up, sort of celebrities who turn up in Munich, football stars, business managers or whatever, the first thing they do is they get themselves a pair of lederhosen and get themselves photographed with the lederhosen on. Have you been down that route?
No, somehow I think a picture of myself in lederhosen is just unconvincing somehow. So, but that's not to say that I haven't been completely seduced and immersed within many of the Bavarian customs. For example, the cuisine. I've become absolutely enamored with, addicted.
Yeah. It is interesting that people, I mean, talking about the lederhosen, it has a serious side, because Bavaria always projects itself as the place of lederhosen and the laptop, of sort of tradition and modernity. Is that how you experience it?
It is very much so. One feels in Bavaria a very strong independence. You also feel this vast history and identification with the history, but the culture to which people identify is a complex one, exactly as you say, at the same time as being very much aware of where past customs come from. There has always been a very dynamic marching towards the future. The laptop, as you say, industry, and also in the arts.
You talk about marching to the future, let's talk about walking. How often do you've mentioned nature already, you've mentioned the mountains, how often do you get to walk in the Alps with your family? I'm really asking how tight is your schedule, but I'm interested in the nature aspect as well.
It's a question of making time. I feel it's very, very important to have the time to think, the time to reflect, and of course being in this beautiful surroundings, this is not only something for myself, but something that has always inspired since generations, artists, composers. So yes, it's important to make the time to do that.
Talking of making time, when are you happiest?
You certainly ask difficult questions. It has something to do with the sharing of music, like all performers. Preparing for a performance is one thing, and you can have a lot of joy to research, to practice, to discover. But I think the real moment of fulfillment for most artists comes from the sharing with the public, and naturally the family as well. Family is a source of great happiness since all of mankind's history.
Do you ever have a bad day at the office? A really rotten concert? You don't have to tell me when, where, or... but.
Working within a cultural institution is like working anyplace else. It's not so much of having a bad day, it's which hour happens to be bad, which hour happens to be good. Thank goodness it balances out in the end.
Okay. We've got a quiz at the end of the show. Quick questions, quick answers. Munich or Berlin?
Oh, that's impossible. I love them both.
Surfboard or walking boots?
Surfboard.
Passion or perfection?
They go together.
Your favourite composer of all time? Quick.
Johann Sebastian Bach.
Lovely. We've been meeting Kent Nagano. It's been a great pleasure. If you've enjoyed it as much as I have, come back next week.